There's this one event from history, almost 500 years ago, that has sparked some of the wildest theories you can imagine. We're talking everything from divine wrath to a literal alien dogfight. Today, we're going to put the original eyewitness account under a modern microscope and figure out what really happened in the skies over Germany, way back in 1561.
I know, it sounds like the opening scene of a blockbuster sci-fi movie, right? An aerial battle in the 16th century? But this isn't fiction. There's a real, detailed, illustrated report from the time that claims hundreds of people watched this chaotic battle unfold right above their heads. So what on earth, or maybe not of this earth, did they actually witness?
Okay, so let's go back in time. Picture it. You're in the bustling city of Nuremberg. It's April 14th, 1561. The sun is just starting to rise, and as people are waking up and starting their day, they look up toward the sun and see something that just defies all logic.
So our entire investigation here, it all starts with one remarkable piece of evidence. It's called a news broadsheet. You can think of it as a 16th century news flyer. It was printed right after the event, and crucially, it has both this dramatic illustration and a really detailed eyewitness report.
The guy who wrote it, an artist named Hans Glaser, he describes just pure chaos. He doesn't just say he saw some weird lights. No, he calls it a dreadful apparition and says that all these objects were violently fighting each other. And get this, it went on for over an hour. Can you imagine the terror of watching that as the sun came up?
So let's break this down like modern investigators looking at the evidence. The report says the sky was just filled with all these bizarre objects. You had spheres of different colors, dull, black, and red. There were blood-red crosses. There were even things that looked like rods or cylinders. And then, some of these objects apparently fell from the sky, trailing smoke, before this whole thing ended with a giant, ominous-looking black spear. I mean, what could possibly connect all these strange things?
To really understand what they thought was happening, we have to try and see the world through their eyes. See, back in the 16th century, an event like this wasn't just some weird thing you saw. For the people of Nuremberg, this was a message straight from God, and it was not a happy message.
This whole thing really comes down to context. In the 16th century, the sky was kind of like God's personal billboard. Strange things happening up there weren't just astronomical curiosities. They were called Wunderzeichen, miraculous signs, and they were almost always seen as warnings that something terrible was about to happen.
And this quote right here, this is the absolute key to their mindset. Glaser's broadsheet wasn't an objective news report. It was a sermon. The whole point of describing this terrifying celestial battle was to frame it as a final, urgent warning from God. You need to repent, and you need to do it now before it's too late.
And you know, this wasn't just some one-off thing in Nuremberg. It was part of a bigger pattern. If we look at the timeline, we see similar stuff happening across Europe. Back in 1535 in Stockholm, a famous painting captured these complex sun halos, and yep, they were seen as a divine omen. Then you have our event in 1561. And just a few years later, in 1566, another broadsheet from Basel, Switzerland, reported dark spheres clashing in the sky. Every time, the interpretation was exactly the same. Heaven is sending us a warning.
Okay, but that was then. Today, we can bring out the big guns, the tools of modern science. So let's leave that 16th century mindset behind for a minute and dive into the scientific theories that could actually explain what happened over Nuremberg.
When you look at the modern debate, it really boils down to two main suspects. On one side, you've got the extraterrestrial theory. It takes the report literally and says, yep, that was an alien spaceship battle. But on the other side, you have the scientific explanation, which points to a rare but totally natural phenomenon involving atmospheric optics.
Now look, an alien dogfight makes for an incredible story, but the scientific consensus is pretty clear, and it points to something far more elegant. The so-called battle was almost certainly a breathtakingly complex display of light, all created by the sun's rays, interacting with tiny ice crystals way up in the atmosphere.
The key that really unlocks this whole mystery has a fancy name, parhelia, but you've probably heard of them as sundogs. Basically, when sunlight passes through millions of tiny, hexagonal, plate-shaped ice crystals that are just floating around high up in the sky, it creates these super bright spots of light on either side of the sun. They look like mock suns. And because of how the crystals move, these spots can appear to shimmer and shift, and they're often just one part of a much bigger, crazier light show in the sky.
And this is where it all just clicks into place. We can literally go down the list from the eyewitness report and match every single description to a known scientific phenomenon. Those blood-red arcs and crosses?
almost certainly sun halos and solar pillars. The numerous spheres that were fighting, those were the parhelia, the sundogs, which seem to move and dance as the sun's angle changes. And what about the falling objects with smoke? That is a textbook description of something called virga, which is just ice crystals evaporating in the dry air before they ever hit the ground.
So when we put all of these pieces together, the historical context, the actual testimony, and what we know from modern science, a really clear picture finally starts to emerge.
So here's the bottom line. That celestial battle from 1561, it was almost certainly a natural, even if incredibly rare and complex, atmospheric event. The report that Hans Glaser wrote wasn't news. It was a moral warning, shaped by all the religious fears of that era. And that famous woodcut, it was stylized to be dramatic and scary, not to be a scientifically accurate sketch. Ultimately, this whole mystery tells us way more about us, about human perception and belief, than it does about visitors from another planet.
So in the end, what looked like an apocalyptic war in the heavens was very likely something much more poetic. It was just the beautiful, simple physics of sunlight playing through frozen water, a natural wonder that was mistaken for a supernatural warning. And that kind of leaves us with a fascinating question, doesn't it? The people of Nuremberg used their worldview, religion, fear, to try and explain something they just couldn't understand. So what about us? What are our modern blind spots? What are we seeing today that will seem perfectly obvious to the explainers of the future?